Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's talk, hosted by the Wiener Holocaust Library. My name's Toby Simpson, and I'm the library's director. Really pleased to have you all here this evening, whether joining us in person or online. We're here tonight for an event that I look forward to every year. We'll be having a talk from the winner of the library's prestigious annual prize for history writing, the Fraenkel Prize. The Fraenkel Prize has now been going for over 30 years, and for some time it's been acknowledged as one of the most important scholarly prizes attainable in the field of Holocaust studies. The reason for this is the sheer quality of the work that's been submitted. Previous winners include such luminaries as Professors Omer Bartov, Marion Kaplan, and Mary Fulbrook. I'm delighted we're joined tonight by the 2021 Fraenkel Prize winner, Dr. Franziska Exeler. Franziska thoroughly deserves to have been awarded the prize this year. She's written the outstanding book, Ghosts of War, Nazi Occupation and Its Aftermath, which we'll be hearing about tonight. The judges of the Fraenkel Prize, Deborah Dwork, Zoe Waxman, and Tim Cole, have asked me to pass on their congratulations to Dr. Exeler. They let me know that although we had many excellent entries in 2021, Franziska's book stood out clearly from the crowd. I'll just read what the judges had to say about it. They found it to be an ambitious and successful deep dive, exploring questions of wartime compliance, complicity, and collaboration, and the post-war toll that these exacted. The book is strikingly original in exploring issues that many have acknowledged, but few have investigated. It's a very worthy winner of this prestigious prize. There's also an obvious timeliness, sadly, to a study of the impact of war in former Soviet territory. And so I'm sure you'll be as keen as I am to hear from the author herself, which you will do in a few minutes. But before I introduce Franziska to you properly, I just want to say a few words about the prize, the Fraenkel Prize, and also its founder, Ernst Fraenkel. I want to give you an idea why this prize means so much to the Wiener Library. Ernst Fraenkel was born in Breslau, Germany, and he grew up there and in Berlin. He came to Britain aged 16, and he came on one of the last kinder transports. He was separated from his parents and his 4 siblings. Ernst went on to be a leading commodity trader, and he also started a wonderful family, and the family remained close to the library to this day. And I'm delighted to say that Ellen Fraenkel, Ernst's daughter, and perhaps also his son Martin, will be joining us remotely this evening. So hello to them. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to greet our online audience. It's great that we're able to do events like tonight in person again, but since the pandemic, we've been making our talks accessible to a much wider audience online through live streaming, and we're doing the same thing tonight. We were able to invest in new equipment for this during the pandemic, and that was thanks to the support of friends and members of the library. So I do want to say thank you to everyone who has supported the library in the past or continues to do so today. We're a charity, we couldn't do this without you, so thank you. This is a good segue, actually, back to Ernst's story. Ernst supported the library, and he did so at a critical moment. Actually, as he was approaching retirement, that was when he was introduced to the library, and at that time, the library was threatened with closure because it was having such serious financial difficulties. This was averted, and it was largely to do with Ernst's efforts. I was privileged to meet Ernst several times. He always struck me as someone focused on people above all. He had such a lively sense of humor and was always keen to meet prize winners. He often took them out to lunch to say congratulations. And I know he'd be very proud that the prize continues to this day. So, taking inspiration from Ernst, I invite you all to join with me celebrating Dr. Exeler's remarkable achievement, as he would have done, with warmth, generosity, and curiosity. Ghosts of War analyzes the prosecution and punishment of Soviet citizens accused of wartime collaboration with the Nazis, and it shows how individuals sought justice, revenge, or assistance from neighbors and courts. It uncovers the many absences, silences, and conflicts that were never resolved. It also investigates the extent to which individuals accommodated, contested, and reshaped official Soviet memory. And what we're left with is a gripping examination of how the past played out into the present in the context of a dictatorship. Franziska Exeler is Assistant Professor of History at the Free University Berlin. She's also a research fellow at the Centre for History and Economics, Magdalen College, University of Cambridge. And so on behalf of the judges of the Fraenkel Prize, everyone here this evening, and on behalf of the library, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Exeler to the lectern.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation to speak today at the Wiener Holocaust Library. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm incredibly honored that my book has been awarded the Ernst Fraenkel Prize. It is really a great honor. I would like to begin with a few words about the books more generally, before moving on to the question of wartime choices and the post-war repercussions. Germany's attack on the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, marked the beginning of the single most destructive military campaign in history. Within weeks, the Soviet Western regions came under German occupation. The mass murder of the Jewish population, alongside the enslavement of the Slavic population, the economic exploitation of the occupied territories, and the destruction of communism as a political system lay at the core of Nazi ideology. The map here on the left shows the German advance into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 and the front line by October 1941. On the map to the right, the yellow line marks the farthest advance of the German army in 1942. In the winter of 1942-43, with the Battle of Stalingrad, the tide of the war turned and the Red Army began to push the Wehrmacht from Soviet territory. After the Red Army reestablished control over the Soviet Western regions, one question shaped encounters between the returning Soviet authorities and those who had lived under Nazi rule, between soldiers and family members, reevacuees and colleagues, Holocaust survivors and their neighbors. What did you do during the war? My book examines people's wartime choices, or what I call the ghosts of war, and their political, social, legal, and personal repercussions. The main questions that I sought to answer were: what is the scope for individual agency in extreme moral circumstances, in this case, Nazi wartime occupation? How do states and societies, social communities, and individuals confront the legacies of war and occupation? And what do truth, guilt, and justice mean in that process? The book reconstructs the intense pressures and constraints within which individuals had to act, and identifies the many reasons why they came to be associated with the German or the Soviet side, or both, or trapped in between. It is also a book about different understandings of what constituted guilt and complicity, about the search for truth and justice in the aftermath of Nazi occupation, and the ways in which this process affected the rebuilding of Soviet state authority, personal lives, and the creation of war narratives. Ghosts of War analyzes the prosecution and punishment of Soviet citizens accused of wartime collaboration with the Nazis, and shows how individuals sought justice, revenge, or assistance from neighbors and courts. It traces the many absences, silences, and conflicts that were never resolved, and the truth that could only be spoken in private. Yet it also investigates the extent to which individuals at once accommodated, contested, and reshaped official Soviet war memory. It is often assumed that in societies that experience war, occupation, and violent conflict, the act of seeking justice and accountability contributes to the development of free public spheres and democratic society, a process also known as transitional justice. In contrast, I wanted to find out how efforts at confronting the past played out within and at times through a dictatorship like the Soviet Union. Geographically, the book focuses on Soviet Belarus, or as it was officially called, the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, an East European borderland that was particularly affected by the Second World War. Like the other Soviet republics, Soviet Belarus was subordinated to the larger Union structure and ultimately the Soviet leadership in Moscow. Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Jews, speakers of Belarusian, Yiddish, Polish, and Russian, those who identified with one nationality or an ethnicity, and those who considered themselves primary locals, all called this region their home. Soviet Belarus is often thought of as a remote place. The opposite, though, was the case. like few other places, the Republic, created in 1919 out of the turmoil of war and revolution, encapsulated the extremes of 20th century European history. In the fall of 1939, following the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Soviet Union invaded and then annexed Eastern Poland. As a result, Soviet Belarus doubled its territory and population, meaning what until then had been Soviet Belarus alone became the eastern part of the Republic, and what until then had been northeastern Poland became the western part of Soviet Belarus. And you can see these territorial changes here on this map, which shows Belarus in its borders from 1921 to the Treaty of Riga to 1941. As you can see, so initially numbers, this would be numbers 1 and then 2 and 3. The Republic was quite small, but then grew in size in the 1920s. It then gained more territory as a result of the Soviet annexation of Eastern Poland. So this is the part with number 4 here. So you pretty much roughly had 2 halves, Eastern and Western Belarus by 1939. During the war, all of Belarus, so all of this region was under Nazi occupation. In 1945, the Białystok region was returned to Poland, so the westernmost part of the Republic, but otherwise the 1939 westward shift of the Republic was retained. In June 1941, Berlin broke the pact with Moscow and attacked the Soviet Union. By the end of August 1941, Soviet Belarus found itself under German rule. Historically, the Eastern Front is often remembered, or you could also say rather misremembered, as a war between Germany and Russia. But the brunt of fighting and occupation was actually borne by the non-Russian Western regions of the Soviet Union. Of all Soviet republics, indeed of all European countries, Belarus suffered proportionally, meaning in proportion to its population size, the highest human losses during the war. About 1.7 to 2.1 million people, or 19 to 22% of the population that by June 1941 lived in the territories that would constitute post-1945 Soviet Belarus, were killed or died as a direct result of the war. This included almost the entire Jewish population of Belarus, an estimated 500,000 to 671,000 people. Belarus was not only one of the main sites of the Holocaust, it was also at the center of Soviet partisan warfare against the Germans. Both preemptively and as a punitive measure, the German army responded with great brutality to any perceived partisan activity. As part of so-called anti-partisan campaigns, the Germans razed approximately 9,200 villages to the ground, more than elsewhere in Nazi-occupied Europe, and killed up to 345,000 civilians, some of them Jews, but overwhelmingly in the majority non-Jewish rural residents. In the summer of 1944, after 3 years of Nazi occupation, the Red Army reestablished control over Soviet Belarus. Yet those who survived were not able to settle down soon. Most cities lay in ruins, entire rural districts had been burned down, and large parts of the population were uprooted or displaced. Massive war-induced migration and displacement, combined with the Polish-Soviet population exchange from 1944 to 1946, meant that hundreds of thousands of people were moving into, out of, within, and through the Republic, trying to get home or trying to avoid just that. Many of the early confrontations with people's wartime choices thus took place at a time when the Soviet state was trying to reestablish its power amid a population in flux. There were 2 particular challenges in writing this book. The first challenge was to be able to account for the complexity of people's wartime choices under Nazi rule and the ways in which these changed over time. The German occupation regime was a regime of death and destruction. Yet it was also a regime that depended on the limited involvement of some. In the occupied territories, the authorities pursued different strategies toward different population groups. While the Jewish population was singled out for destruction, the Slavic population was treated with a mix of brutality and co-optation. In both regions under military and civilian rule, the German administration depended heavily on the employment of Soviet citizens and in each district, Soviet citizens were appointed as town and district mayors or as local policemen. As the Germans also kept the organizational structure of the Soviet administration's lower levels intact, many who had worked as, for example, office clerks in a Soviet city administration continued to work in the same positions under the Germans. All of this meant that for civilians in occupied territory, it was impossible not to come in contact with the occupation regime. Some people actively joined the German side and took part in atrocities, for example, as local policemen who participated in the murder of the Jewish communities. Others became much more reluctantly, even unwillingly complicit or entangled in Nazi crimes. It is, of course, impossible to write about the choices that individuals make under foreign occupation without writing about collaboration. The meaning of that term, though, continues to spark much debate. Attempts at defining collaboration are often met with a concern that the notion fails to adequately capture the complexities of wartime reality. A town mayor or policeman who held power over life and death was both physically and morally in a very different position than someone who worked as a journalist for a German-sponsored newspaper. And what to make of coerced engagement, such as when someone who had been forcibly recruited into police service became complicit in German crimes. In my understanding of how local involvement with the occupiers came about, I follow Jan Gross's description of it as an occupier-driven phenomenon. People's engagement with the Germans, its logic, appeal, self-justification, and social base emerged in each country at the intersection between the occupier's intent and the occupier's perception about the range of options that people had at their disposal. In the book, I trace the reasons and motivations behind people's actions and how these in turn were perceived and assessed by others after the war. In order to be able to fully capture the complexity of human behavior, the book draws on a wide range of different sources and perspectives. These range from Soviet and German internal state documents to letters, memoirs, shorter recollections, and oral history interviews in multiple European languages. The voices of individuals are central to the analysis. These were, to name just a few, individuals like Hasia Bornstein-Bielitzka, Vasil Bukow, Olga Bembel-Diedork, or Litman Moore, whom you can see here on this slide. These four individuals came from very different religious, social, and political backgrounds, and they also lived in different parts of the region, indicated here in yellow on the map. They had in common, though, that all of them called this East European borderland their home. And like countless others, their lives were transformed by the Second World War. While examining people's wartime choices, the second challenge in writing this book I found was to account for people's pre-war experiences with Soviet rule and how these pre-war experiences with Soviet rule then impacted the choices that people made under German wartime rule. For that, we have to recall the different interwar histories of Western and Eastern Belarus. By 1941, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, Eastern Belarus had been Soviet for roughly 2 decades. Western Belarus, however, had belonged to Poland in the interwar years and was only annexed in the fall of 1939. On the map here, you can also see this dotted line indicates the pre-1939 Soviet-Polish border. So roughly equal in size, Western and Eastern Belarus. The populations living in these two parts of Belarus had thus experienced Soviet rule in different ways. To Eastern Belarus, Sovietization, which included the violent collectivization of agriculture, had come as a revolution from within, with significant local agency. To Western Belarus, it had come as an express Sovietization from abroad, in the form of Red Army soldiers and cadres from the East. In both cases, Soviet rule came with a significant amount of state violence, with people killed or deported, even more so in Eastern Belarus than in Western Belarus. As to how these experiences shape people's wartime choices under the Germans, what I found is that when the German army invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the decisions that people in Eastern and Western Belarus made were initially often influenced by their prior experiences with Soviet rule, or else their relationship to the Bolsheviks. Party members or individuals who held important positions within the Soviet party state were more likely to flee east, while many who had previously suffered under the Soviets were among those who had joined the German organized police forces. Another factor that greatly influenced local behavior in the first phase of the war was the presence or relative absence of radical anti-Soviet nationalists, or more generally, the influence of the political nationalist right. In the summer of 1941, during the transition from Soviet to German rule, a wave of anti-Jewish violence committed by local residents and usually instigated by the Germans swept through those Soviet Western regions that were annexed to the Soviet Union in 1939 and 1940. And on the smaller left on the left, that one shows these territorial annexations, all the way from Estonia down to Bessarabia. And so these are the territories where the wave of anti-Jewish violence happens in the summer of 1941, in June and July 1941. Still, in terms of scope, intensity, and brutality, local anti-Jewish violence varied greatly throughout these territories. The pogroms were most intense in regions where the radical political right had a strong base of support, as it was the case in the Białystok region, which also included Jedwabne. From 1939 to 1941, Białystok region constituted the westernmost part of Belarus, but it was then handed back to Poland in 1945. The level of local anti-Jewish violence was also high in Western Ukraine, where radical anti-Soviet nationalist groups like the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists were active, and in the Romanian administered regions of Northern Bukovina and Bessarabia. In Western Belarus, excluding the Białystok region, so on the map, if you look to the map, and you see Białystok regions indicated, and then essentially the westernmost part, number 4 on the map, which was retained and remained part of Soviet Belarus after the war. Here in these regions, radical nationalist organizations were fewer and much weaker. And so the level of violence was already much lower there. For Eastern Belarus, such programs have not been recorded. With a few exceptions, local anti-Jewish violence has also not been recorded in the other old Soviet regions. So those like Eastern Ukraine and Western Russia that belonged to the Soviet Union for roughly 2 decades before the war. Perhaps on a side note, so the history of these pogroms and the great regional variation in terms of their intensity, scope, and brutality can only be understood really in a comparative perspective across the Soviet Western regions, and not by focusing on one Soviet republic like Belarus or Ukraine alone. I can't really go more in detail here, but if there's interest, then I could do so later during the Q&A. To return to the question of what shaped people's initial wartime choices, as mentioned, in the first stage of the war and occupation, the decisions that people in Eastern and Western Belarus made were initially often influenced by their prior experiences with Soviet rule, or else their relationship to the Bolsheviks. Once partisan warfare picked up in mid-1942, and civilians found themselves confronted with demands from both sides, though, people's wartime choices came to be much more determined by situational factors. This included the will to survive, coercion, violence, patriotism, which was not identical with a belief in communism, or simply the proximity of one's village to either a German garrison or a Soviet partisan zone. In other words, people's decisions and their consequences varied over time, and complicity and entanglement were questions of degree. Moreover, since the partisans were by 1943 mostly people from Belarus, and since the lower organs of the German occupation regime remained overwhelmingly staffed with people from Belarus, locals essentially found themselves fighting against other locals. In parts of Western Belarus, the situation was exacerbated by the presence of the Polish Armia Krajowa, and in Southern Belarus by the presence of Ukrainian nationalist formations. While members of these groups at times cooperated with the Germans, and some Polish units initially also with the Soviet partisans, in the end, the war behind the front erupted into a multi-dimensional conflict in which the Soviet partisans the different nationalist partisans, and the Germans and their local representatives all fought each other, and civilians suffered amid the violence. Consequently, and adapting a term coined by Lawrence L. Langer, many choices that people in occupied territory made were choiceless choices. By that I mean that when people were confronted with decisions, all options entailed a destructive effect on their personal lives, families, and local communities. For example, when a village had to decide whether to hand over villagers as forced laborers to the German authorities and fear reprisals from the partisans, or refuse to do so and fear German collective punishment. Yet when the Soviet authorities returned to Belarus in the summer of 1944, they did not show an understanding for these gray zones of occupation. In the post-war years, the pursuit of truth and justice was a common goal for individuals, communities, and the Soviet authorities alike. Yet they often held different understandings of what that meant. For many inhabitants of post-war Belarus, confronting the ghosts of war was a highly individualized process, contingent on a multitude of interacting factors, circumstances, and personal experiences. While the urge for moral justice and retribution was shared widely, people pursued this goal in different ways, with the help of the Soviet state, through non-state channels, or by a combination of the two. Some, in particular Holocaust survivors who returned to the places they once called home, confronted neighbors directly, demanding the restitution of property that they had acquired during the war. Other people resorted to revenge violence, for example, by beating up a fellow villager accused of having worked for the Germans, as it has been recorded for several villages in eastern and western Belarus. Still others chose less physical forms of retribution, such as agreeing to become informers for the state security organs or writing a letter to the state in the hope that this would help to identify those they deemed German accomplices and wartime traitors. When complicated property conflicts were involved, individuals were likely to pursue justice both through and outside of state channels. In contrast to this highly varied individualized behavior, the Soviet authorities pursued a central line that came all the way from the top, from the leadership in Moscow. And this line then was to be applied uniformly across the Soviet Western regions. For Soviet party state leaders, state security officers, and members of the judiciary and procuracy, finding out what people in occupied territory had done was a task of utmost importance, inextricably linked to the reestablishment of Soviet power. In absolute numbers, no country that was occupied during the Second World War prosecuted as many of its own nationals for what they had done under foreign rule as the Soviet Union. Although I should say that China might be an exception, but we have no reliable numbers in that case. The majority of Soviet citizens who were charged with treason were convicted in secret, in quick trials that lacked fundamental standards of rule of law-based legal systems, such as an independent judiciary, independent defense attorneys, and the assumption of innocent until proven guilty that formed a precondition for any trial to be considered as impartial as possible. While the war was still being fought, however, the punishment of Soviet citizens in newly reconquered regions was also frequently and deliberately conducted in front of local audiences in the locality where a person had, for example, acted as a village elder or policeman during Nazi rule. Many of these public prosecutions were carried out by Red Army military courts as the troops were advancing westward. One such wartime trial here is shown on this slide here. The image was taken in the village of Usvyaty in Smolensk Oblast in northwestern Russia, which the Soviet army had retaken by the fall of 1943. On trial was a man by the name of Basilev, who during the German occupation had served as the head of this village, of Usvyaty village. He's standing, it's a little bit hard to make out, but he's standing in the center right of the photo, in front of what looks like a jury of 3 officers, surrounded by at least 4 armed guards, other soldiers, and what probably were his fellow villagers, most of them women. The image clearly suggests just how improvised and quick these Red Army trials were. We know from, for example, from memoirs by military prosecutors who recount these trials that these usually took place within a day, 2 at most. So people were identified, and then these improvised trials were conducted in front of local audiences. And if they were to be executed, then their bodies were left hanging at the gallows in publicly sort of visible spaces to kind of serve as a reminder to the others. After the troops then moved westward, the prosecution of civilians for wartime treason primarily became the responsibility of the state security organs. And then there were also much fewer public trials, and most of the prosecutions were taking place in secret, so to say, without any audiences to attend. The Soviet punishment of suspected wartime traitors then was swift, harsh, and sweeping. At the same time, punitive practices were not static, but rather varied over time, alternating throughout the post-war years between more lenient and stricter, less active and more expensive phases. The prosecution of Soviet citizens accused of wartime treason began in late 1941, after the Red Army, in its first counteroffensive, regained territories in Western Russia. In this early phase of reconquest, punishment was particularly strict and indiscriminate, and the death sentence was common. Soon, though, the Politburo in Moscow grew alarmed by military tribunal reports that stressed the state security organ's improper qualification of crimes, and it tried to clarify the legal basis of punishment. In 1943, several political and judicial bodies, central bodies in Moscow, issued a series of instructions that introduced a legal distinction between traitor on the one hand and accomplice on the other hand. These instructions also specified the corresponding acts and then set different sentences ranging from imprisonment to the death penalty. The real turning point in the state's politics of retribution, though, occurred during the first half of 1944. By the late spring, the Red Army had pushed the Wehrmacht, the German army, from Western Russia, Eastern and Central Ukraine, including Kiev, and parts of Eastern Belarus around Homel. During these first months of 1944, a noticeable change took place. Overall, punishment became less strict. As reports by Soviet military tribunals operating in Eastern Belarus show, during the first post-occupation weeks and months, the death penalty was less common than one might have expected. The ratio of death penalty to prison sentence dropped further in the next 2 years. A similar trend, so that meaning that labor camp sentences were much more common than the death penalty, was also observed in Ukraine between 1943 and 1945. This moderation of punitive practices should not be mistaken for an increase in due process of law. Rather, it was brought about by shifting political circumstances, which led to recalibration of state priorities. As the Red Army was regaining more and more territory from the Germans, retribution evolved into a process in which different objectives and interests had to be weighed against each other. Reclaiming authority by way of punishment, yet also portraying the Soviet state as a liberator and guarantor of justice, even as it was facing a shortage of experienced personnel. After Stalin's death in 1953, as part of limited de-Stalinization efforts, the state moderated its punitive policies and in 1955 issued a partial amnesty. However, in the 1960s, then, domestic and international changes spurred a second wave of public trials. As a statute of limitations did not exist for treason, the prosecution of Soviet citizens accused of wartime collaboration continued until the late 1980s. This sort of balancing act, which we see in the Soviet politics of retribution, was not free of tensions and contradictions. The Soviet leaders were determined to punish local participation in German atrocities, and they did prosecute and sentence many of them, individuals who, usually in their capacity as local policemen, had abused, killed, or helped to kill Jewish and non-Jewish Soviet citizens during the war. Yet at its core, the search for those deemed traitors was about defining political loyalty. That meant that despite the relative moderation of punishment that began in 1944, the Soviet leadership continued to regard the war as a test that revealed people's true loyalties. In consequence, they showed no understanding for the moral raisons of occupation. In their rulings, Soviet military tribunals did not consider external pressures, constraint, or intent as mitigating factors. They also dismissed any recourse to pragmatism as a justifiable reason for people's wartime choices. In other words, choiceless choices that some individuals in occupied territory were forced to choose between two options that had a similarly destructive effect on their communities did not exist for them. At the same time, though, it's interesting to see that the Soviet authorities were willing to accommodate their own pragmatic wartime choices. And they also did not hold everyone accused of treason accountable by the same standard. During the war, Moscow actively encouraged Soviet citizens who served in the German organized police forces to join the Soviet partisans. This was a deliberate policy. It was promoted by none other than Panteleimon Ponomarenko, the first secretary of the Communist Party of Belarus, and also the head of the Soviet partisan movement. And that policy was approved by Stalin. These quote unquote traitors turned partisans were later also the only group in whose cases Soviet military courts systematically took mitigating circumstances into account, lowering their sentences significantly, meaning the fact that they had fought and some of them, been injured or fought for substantial period of time on the Soviet side, then counted as a mitigating factor for the fact that prior to that, they had fought on the German side. And so then their sentences would have been really high, were then lowered by a couple of years. Such contradictory practices resulted from tensions between ideological imperatives and pragmatic concerns, but they also resulted from tensions within ideology. On the one hand, the state maintained that the civilian population in occupied territory had fully supported the Soviet partisans. On the other hand, Ponomarenko and other high-ranking Bolsheviks believed that the war had helped to uncover mass enemies in hiding, eternal enemies who had gone into hiding in the interwar years, yet who had resurfaced and joined the Germans in 1941. Ultimately, the Soviet authorities were unable to establish a consensus on just what exactly working for the Germans, or Работали у немцев, as internal state documents put it, had entailed. While the case of policemen and village heads seemed easy to judge, more confusion continued to exist regarding teachers, agricultural specialists, or office clerks who had worked in the German overseen administration. Given the dire lack of cadres, the Soviet state continued to employ many of them. But the authorities' suspicion, palpable in the denial, for example, of higher education or professional advancement, did not diminish over the years. Anyone who had lived under Nazi rule could be suspect, as best expressed in one line on the bibliographical questionnaires that Soviet citizens had to fill out before beginning a new job or entering university. There, on this biographical questionnaire, it asked, "Did you live in occupied territory?" To conclude, the search for truth, guilt, and justice in the aftermath of Nazi occupation was a multidimensional process located at numerous levels of state and society. While the Soviet authorities were determined to punish local participation in German crimes, at its core, the state's search for suspected traitors was about defining political loyalty. In contrast, individuals confronted the ghost of war in a variety of different ways. The aftermath of German occupation saw tremendous personal grief, trauma, and enduring silences. But it also witnessed the rebuilding of personal lives and attempts at finding one's place in the official war narrative. As particular as these personal processes were to each individual, though, if there was one line dividing the population, not just in Belarus, but in the Soviet Union at large, then it ran between those who had lived under German rule and those who had not. After the war, many civilians who returned from the Soviet rear or from the front shared with the authorities their distrust towards those who had lived in occupied territory. Like elsewhere in Europe, women faced a gendered stigma and were accused of horizontal collaboration. The mistrust extended to those who had been taken to Germany as forced laborers and to Red Army soldiers who had survived German captivity. Even former Soviet partisans were not always exempt, depending on when and under what circumstances they had joined the movement. Although people's prejudices towards those who had lived under Nazi rule did not always have to be articulated fully, biases nevertheless lingered on for decades after the war, with the potential to appear at any moment, usually during small, everyday social conflicts. Post-war social interactions and encounters, both in public and in private, therefore also showed that for many people, actual, alleged, or surmised wartime behavior and post-war belonging were intertwined issues, whether that meant belonging to a family, a local community, or the Soviet nation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Franziska. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. And I actually have a couple of questions which I'd like to ask. So while people are gathering their thoughts, both online and in the room, I thought I could maybe start by asking a bit about the role of the West, because my own research when I was doing my PhD was around East Germany, and I'm also recently been looking at Mary Fulbrook's book on post-war justice. And at certain moments, the investigations that were happening in the West, especially from the 1960s, played a role in East Germany. And sometimes it was very uncomfortable because as time went on, former perpetrators have become more and more integrated into the regime in East Germany. So I just wondered if at certain points, investigations in the West played any role in post-war justice in Belarus. That was my first question. And then I also had a second question, which was about anti-Semitism. And that was kind of prompted by the exhibition we have on today. And there were several waves of anti-Semitism that emanated from Moscow, really, at times like the Prague Spring. And even though the Jewish population in Belarus had been largely murdered, I just wondered again whether those wider trends in anti-Semitism also were visible in Belarus like they were in, for example, Poland.
Thank you so much for these questions. I was already starting to think about the first one about these sort of dynamics between prosecutions in the East and the West, because that's really a fascinating topic and one that has many layers to it, I think. We definitely, so the short answer in some ways would be yes, there are very much these dynamics, and they are actually quite, global, very international. So the Soviet prosecution of Soviet citizens is taking place parallel to the Soviet prosecution of German and other Axis soldiers, with the slight difference that ends by in the early 1950s, the prosecution of German and other Axis soldiers in the Soviet Union for what we today would call war crimes. And the Soviet prosecution of Soviet citizens continues into the 1980s. But in all of these cases, in the public trials, if they are held in public, then there's a discursive connection being drawn to the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. So there's a wave of trials, and the first series of public trials of German and other Axis soldiers corresponds then to select public trials of Soviet citizens, which are all taking place as the IMT is taking place at Nuremberg from 1945 to 1946. Then there's a second wave of trials of German and other Axis soldiers, which has its starting point in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp trial that the Soviet authorities conduct in East Berlin in 1947. And we can tell from the internal documents that this was really envisioned by the Politburo as such. So the first trial, the international trial, is the one in East Berlin of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. And then there's a subsequent trial of public trials of German and other Axis soldiers in 1947 in Soviet cities. And then there's a trial at Khabarovsk in the Far East of Japanese soldiers in 1949. And the Soviets envisioned this as sort of the war crimes trials that did not happen in East Asia. So they, as sort of the trial, so they envisioned it as the trial that the Americans did not put on, so to say, but that would then be put on by them. So we have these international dynamics of who can claim to be prosecuting, who can claim to be really, like, how should we put it? Like, who can really claim to be prosecuting in a consequent and coherent manner. And we see that playing then out in the 1960s very much, in the Eichmann trial in 1961 in Jerusalem in many ways brings about very new global dynamics where we see a Cold War competition almost, or in the Soviet Union, and often rightly so, accusing the West of harboring war criminals. And so a lot of these trials, just to sort of briefly conclude, that take place in the 1960s in East Germany are very much motivated by the sense of West Germany isn't doing anything. There's a huge continuization of Nazi functionaries. And although these trials that are put on in East Germany and the Soviet Union are heavily flawed from like a legal perspective, as I was mentioning. They had a point. They often got it right in the sense that they and they also very much got it right in the sense that the West was failing, sheltering them. And then it's not just West Germany, but the Soviet Union is also accusing the US and Canada, or no, sorry, the US to less extent, US and the UK of harboring war criminals. And by that, they mean people who were able to leave, so ended up in Germany, former policemen in 1945, and through DP camps then emigrated to Britain and or the US, and who they accused of having committed crimes in the name of German power. And in these cases too, I mean, they got the Soviet trials got the substance right. It's just that the trial in itself weren't fair.
Mm-hmm. And then the second question I had was about anti-Semitism and whether there were still important dynamics with anti-Semitism in Belarus in the same way that there were in other post-Soviet states.
Yeah, I think we can say that that's sort of there's very similar dynamics throughout the different Soviet republics. We can see it in how it affects the publication of memoirs, for example. So Hersch Smoler, who was one of the leaders of the first Minsk underground or resistance organization of 1941 to 1942, he was able to publish his memoirs about the Minsk ghetto underground resistance first in Yiddish, and then it was translated into Russian in the sort of first half, and in the first years, sort of in the mid-1940s, right immediately after the war. So that's something that towards the end of the 1940s, when we see anti-Semitism, state-sponsored anti-Semitism really pick up in the Soviet Union, is no longer possible. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of a phase where, for example, Jewish accounts of the Holocaust or of resistance can be published in the Soviet Union, but then later on cannot be, and is being suppressed by censorship.
And was that partly because of building a partisan narrative that excluded Jewish identity, that was very much an ethnic Russian partisan narrative?
That's a very good question. So in this particular case, it also has to do with the fact that the Minsk underground in 1941 to 1942 has different subgroups. So there's one in the ghetto that operates in the ghetto, and then there are other groups that operate throughout the city. So in the other parts of the city, and they are connected. They have contacts with each other, and some of them are Communist Party members, and others are not. And this is a resistance organization that, again, like forms very early on in 1941, shortly after the summer of 1941. The Soviet authorities later on have to deny the existence of this resistance organization, both the Jewish resistance organization in the ghetto, but also the one that's operating in the other parts of the city, because it essentially constitutes an embarrassment to them, because the communist leaders fled Minsk 3 days before the Germans arrive in the city. And so this resistance is a kind of grassroots underground that forms without sort of direct Soviet orders and control. And so later on, the Soviet leadership in Belarus accuses this early Minsk underground, 1941 of 1942, to be the work of Germans and spies and provocateurs. So this is also a very interesting case to see how it was possible in the Soviet Union after Stalin's death, within limits, obviously, but to kind of contest the state narrative and wanting to be included in it, because former members of this Minsk underground continued to, after Stalin's death, when the political situation changes somewhat, continue to petition the authorities and say, we were a legitimate resistance underground organization, do acknowledge us. And Khrushchev is very receptive to that, also because he has this personal rivalry with Ponomarenko, the leader of Soviet Belarus in the 1940s. And the the Minsk underground members say that, it's personally Ponomarenko who wants to suppress their story. So there are power struggles between Khrushchev and Ponomarenko. But in any case, within 20 years, the narrative of the Minsk underground is really overturned, and they are recognized as an early resistance organization. So it shows that, even within limits, it was possible to kind of try to stretch the official war narrative and petition to be included in it.
That's really fascinating. I could have many more questions I could ask, but I should give the opportunity for others to ask questions. So are there any questions in the room for Franziska? Yes, question here. Oh, sorry, I better give you a microphone.
Thank you. Of course, Stalin was an ally of Hitler at the beginning. So I just wonder what became of that. Well, I guess that was taboo, if not illegal, to say that in the Soviet Union. But how did they deal with that? I mean, even now, I mean, I don't think they really, they don't really, the Russians don't talk about the fact that Stalin and the Soviet Union was an ally of Hitler at the beginning. And the other thing, well, it's just a kind of personal thing. It was in about 1992, I went to Białystok. Actually, I went on a bird watching trip to Eastern Poland. We're based in Hajnówka, which is a small town, but we went to Białystok. We also went to Ukraine, absolutely beautiful, bird watching, and it's heartbreaking now. I mean, to think, the wildlife and that is being destroyed, it's now a war zone. But in Białystok, we went to a market, and there were Soviet paraphernalia, Soviet time. This was just after the fall of communism. And so there was badges and stuff like that. But there was also Nazi paraphernalia. I was so shocked to see, just quite openly, as if it was something, as if they were kind of like, normal things, swastikas. So, and, evidently perfectly normal, legal, no stigma attached to it whatsoever. So I was really shocked by that. So, well, that was just, so I don't think that, I mean, all right, that was in 1992. I don't think they've really, at least at that time, they had not faced up to their part in, massacres of Jews and collaboration with Nazis. Really.
I mean, I think Jan Gross, the publication of Jan Gross's book Neighbors was really seminal in sparking these discussions, mostly in Poland, because it concerned the case of Jedwabne, so a small town in the Białystok region, which, as I mentioned before, formerly belonged to Belarus from 1939 to 1941, but was handed back to Poland after 1945, and is a primarily Polish-speaking region and Catholic region, And so that book has really sparked very intense public debates, and I think it shows how raw and emotional the memory of the Second World War is to this day. I mean, across Eastern Europe, and I'm including Germany here as well, like. How contentious some issues still are, these very sensitive questions of what did you do during the war, what did neighbors do during the war, or what should we rethink war narratives that states have constructed for their societies. And it's similar, I think, in some ways. I mean, there are many differences also then between these kind of more like discussions that focus more on one society, Polish societies, or Poland and versus Belarus and Russia. But in Belarus, all of this is obviously very much complicated by the fact that it's a very authoritarian state, and there's a very strong state-sponsored narrative of the war in place, which is very similar to the Soviet narrative, only slightly more nationalistic, with a much more negative assessment of Lithuanians and Ukrainians. But otherwise, there's a strong continuation. And this is not to say that critical or nuanced scholarship that deviates from that isn't possible, but it carries high social and political costs. So to study, to this day, the annexation of northeastern Poland and then it becoming Western Belarus is called the liberation of Western Belarus in schools and school books in Belarus. So because that region was also one where it had a majority sort of Belarusian speaking population. And I don't mean to, this is not about like what's right or wrong here, but it's what's interesting to see. It's the same kind of Soviet narrative of the liberation of Western Belarus or the liberation of Western Ukraine from Poland in 1939. And if you question that, then you essentially exclude yourself from the chance of pursuing a career in history in a university in Belarus. So the question is, and most people who do that kind of critical research by now live outside of Belarus anyhow. In Russia, it's a little bit different, since my understanding, also from having personally lived there, always was, and having lived in Belarus as well, was that until recently it was more possible to conduct, research on the Second World War that was not politicized. It was much more possible to say things that you couldn't have said in Belarus in a professional context. That is now radically changing, or has radically changed with the war. And so the Hitler-Stalin Pact, for example, has been critically examined by historians, and I myself was a postdoc at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, which had a fantastic center for the study of the history of the Second World War, where you would have these kinds of discussions. But with the war now, Russia's war against Ukraine, all of that, these sort of space for that kind of expression has been radically limited. And so that also, the war in that sense also is going to have long-term consequences for research and international cooperation discussions.
Yes, I was wondering if you might expand on that a little bit, because we were talking a bit before about your book and the way in which it's not only timely for us to learn about this now, but also, thank goodness you completed this book when you did, because if you were to attempt to do it now, it would probably be impossible. Would you not say?
Yeah. Unfortunately, yes. So in the case of Belarus, that has everything to do with the protests of civil society against the re-election of Lukashenko in the summer of 2020, and the crackdown on any form of opposition or perceived opposition since then. And so in Belarus, ever since the summer of 2020, things have further deteriorated. And research by international scholars coming to Belarus is practically impossible. But it's also impossible at the moment for scholars in Belarus, because the current the Lukashenko government is trying very much to politicize the white, red, white flag, so the flag that's being used by the opposition, and they're trying to declare it a fascist symbol. So the most of the files that I actually looked at, the documents for this book, which are relating to the Second World War, are now being reviewed by the prosecutor in Belarus for their political purposes. So even off limits to scholars in Belarus. So the situation that was already difficult prior to that, obtaining a visa to Belarus, obtaining a temporary residency permit, being allowed to use the archives, lots of material still being classified, has now, ever since, I said, the protests or the crackdown, the backlash of the government against the protests in 2020 become impossible and very difficult even for scholars in Belarus.
Thank you for sharing that. I wondered if we have any questions online. Okay, a further question in the room? Was there a question at the back? A question at the front here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I always find myself with an incredible headache when I'm trying to work out languages and nationalities in this part of the world. I'm particularly interested in a Polish Jewish composer called Weinberg, Mieczysław Weinberg, and he escaped to Minsk in 1939 at the age of 19. On his way from escaping, he saw a great many atrocities committed by the Germans. His sister left. He left his sister because she didn't have the right shoes, which always seemed like a most peculiar excuse. But anyway, she and his parents eventually died, though they don't know where. But once he got to Minsk, it seemed that there was quite an active cultural life. He became a part of the conservatoire. He was accepted as a refugee. He was taught by Ilya Muzin, who's one of the great music teachers in eventually St. Petersburg Conservatoire. So there obviously was quite a large Jewish cultural life going on in Minsk in 1939-40, when he then escaped to Tashkent, where he married Solomon Mikhail's daughter. And Mikhail's, who of course was murdered in Minsk. But he was going there to address the Jewish Congress, wasn't he? Or raise funds for some kind of Jewish organization that he dealt with in America. So there must have been some kind of quite formidable Jewish life going on in Minsk, and both in the 40s, the early 40s, and the mid to late 40s. Or am I completely wrong about that?
No, I think, I mean, one of the Soviet Union in 1920s and 1930s was one of the few states, if not perhaps the only state, that had like a strict kind of policy against anti-Semitism and acted on it in the interwar years, especially when we see anti-Semitism on the rise elsewhere. I mean, Nazi Germany, but also then in Poland and other places in East Central Europe. And the Soviet Union was sort of the one who, again, pursued these very active campaigns against anti-Semitism. And that's also, again, another difference between Eastern and Western Belarus, that because of these policies and against discrimination pursued by the Soviet authorities, but also new forms of social mobility that opened up in the interwar years to people living in the Soviet Union, we see that among all, there are higher levels of inter-ethnic integration in the cities. There's still a large distinction between the countryside and the cities in the interwar years that we see, but overall levels of inter-ethnic integration are higher, I would say, in the old Soviet territories that come under German rule than in the new Soviet territories, than in what was formerly Eastern Poland. And so during the war, that means that, for example, Jews who lived in cities in Eastern Belarus were more likely than to depend on the help that was extended through these support networks. So it wasn't necessarily, always Communist Party, quite on the contrary, it was friends or acquaintances. And whereas in Eastern Poland, religion was a much in the Soviet Union. So there is a space for Yiddish culture in the 1920s. That space becomes more limited in the 1930s, and it still exists after the war. There's a Yiddish theater in Minsk, and then very, very limited to almost non-existent in the late 1940s. But that was a Yiddish culture that was supposed to be a Soviet Yiddish culture. So it's not religious, in contrast to the religious kind of Jewish culture that exists in Poland, for example. But within these limits, yes, and it's also part of in the 1920s, part of the so-called indigenization or korenizacja campaigns, that the idea was that each particular culture or language that was part of the Soviet Union would be promoted. And Yiddish for a while, next to Polish and Belarusian Russian, in the early years of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, was a state language. All of that changed then later on, especially after the Second World War, Russian becomes the dominant language of the state.
I think that's actually a really fascinating theme that you're talking about. I've been wondering about asking you about, I suppose, the whole question of the legacy of the Soviet Empire, which is a huge question. I sort of was led to it by what you were saying about how things changed in the late 30s, because in some ways a kind of, I suppose, nationalistic chauvinism came back into Soviet culture. I mean, even beginning with the Great Purges, in a way that the NKVD became increasingly, there was more extensive persecution of ethnic minorities. And the reason I ask that is a lot of what you're talking about is extreme violence. And of course, your book raises the question, is Belarus sort of an extreme or an exceptional case? And so I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about, I suppose, ethnic nationalism on the one hand, or maybe also imperialism or colonialism on the other hand. Where is this extreme violence coming from in your assessment of it? And this is a really big kind of conceptual question, but I just wanted to ask you a bit, because books like Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, they really talk about this part of the world being an exceptional case. Do you kind of agree with that as far as violence is concerned? And if so, where do you see that violence coming from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, so one of the arguments I try to make in the book is to show that, like, very generally speaking, yes, there are obviously some differences between the individual Soviet republics that come under German rule. So between Ukraine, Belarus, Western Russia, and the Baltic states. And then there are differences between Western and Eastern Belarus pertaining to these different interwar histories of these two parts of the republic. But there are also many similarities. There is in some parts of the literature, not necessarily the scholarly literature, but there's somewhat of a narrative in place that says that Belarus is entirely different. And I found that also in some parts of scholarship itself in Belarus that says Belarus was not anti-Semitic in contrast to Ukraine. And what my book tries to say is that this is much too generalized as a statement to make. Like, we always have to carefully look at, or we have to ask ourselves, what kind of question are we asking? And then what kind of time period are we looking at? So in terms of, for example, anti-Semitism in the local population, we see the entire spectrum of how non-Jews respond to the abuse and mistreatment and then murder of the Jewish communities at the hands of the Germans. So, and there's the entire spectrum that ranges from, yes, there are those who participate and help to murder them or denounce them, to rescue and shelter and trying to help. And now, even if you have a spectrum, obviously, of human behavior, you could still have quantitative differences within that. So it could be that more people in Belarus were willing to help than elsewhere. That is methodologically extremely hard to quantify. What I have found in my research is that it comes down to, I think, which we can say much more clearly, is that there's not a stark difference between Western and Eastern Belarus when it comes to that. So we cannot say that more people in Eastern Belarus, because of the Soviet legacy or higher levels of inter-ethnic integration, help than in Western Belarus. But we can see that these support networks have a different kind of structures, as said. Like, the support in Eastern Belarus often comes through much more, the support networks reflect this higher levels of inter-ethnic integration. And so that would be one difference. But another structural difference is also that these radical nationalist groups, who are often the ones who play a crucial role in instigating local violence. So, and I think that's something that we can generalize as well. I mean, we can see this in the case of sort of the Balkans during the Second World War. There's research has been done on that as well, that you see that if there are groups of small groups of radical people who are sort of extremist and often nationalist, and who are willing to be violent, then they are often the ones who drive local violence if it's also instigated from above, for example, by the Germans or others. And their presence can really make a huge difference. And this is also why we see regional variation in this wave of local violence against Jews in the summer of 1941. And the violence, level of violence, the highest where we have these small units of radical nationalists active, who then drive the dynamics of local violence. And in the case of Belarus, with, again, the exception of Białystok province, which is a region which is a bit of an outlier because it is handed back to Poland in 1945, and it has a different kind of population structure. But they're in the sort of in the remaining part of Western Belarus, which remains Western Belarus after 1945. These anti-national or these national anti-Soviet groups exist, but they are much fewer, and many of them only arrive with the Germans. And so that's also a difference, for example, to Western Ukraine. And again, like, they are often ones who play a crucial role in local dynamics of violence.
I have to say, the way you've just explained that so simply it's just incredibly impressive. It's been a pleasure to listen to you talk about this subject, which is hugely complex, but so important in terms of our understanding of the Holocaust and its legacies. So I just want to thank you on behalf of the audience at home, the audience in the room, a very worthy winner of the Fraenkel Prize 2021, Dr. Exeler.
Thank you very much.
I do want to let everyone know that Dr. Exeler's book is available to buy online, and we also have a copy at the library for anyone who'd like to come in and make use of it. So with that, I'd just like to wish you all a very good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much.